Greetings to you all, and welcome to the Suppressed Trust Policy Dialogue Forum on Zoom, and it's being streamed on Facebook and subsequently on YouTube. Welcome especially to our guests from all over the world, but more so for our panelists. And in this regard, I'm pleased to welcome my old comrade, L.B. Sachs, former Justice of the Constitutional Court, Luanda Kaso, attorney and writer, author, contributor to the book One Law, One Nation, in celebration of the 15th anniversary of the Constitution of South Africa. Aubrey Mashiki, another old comrade of mine, political analyst and prominent commentator. Stephen Friedman, professor for the study of democracy. And Welshman Ngube, a Zimbabwean academic, professor of law, prominent politician. Today we're looking at the raging debate on the constitution in South Africa, contextualizing it in relation to the Zimbabwe situation in particular, and the African continent in general. The debate, the so-called raging debate, was prompted, of course, by the statement by the Minister of Tourism, Lindiwe Sisulu, a dear comrade of ours. And the debate has been so interesting that we felt it necessary to discuss it in the context of highlighting the importance of constitutionalism, the rule of law, and contrasting that, as we say in our concept note, that notwithstanding the pitfalls, the shortcomings of the South African situation, we'd like to extol it as a good example in constitutionalism and rule of law, and the maintenance of the institutions, including the judiciary, as we have seen. This is in sharp contrast to the situation in our country, Zimbabwe. And it is that contrast that we want to look at first at the South African Constitution itself. And I think Stephen Friedman has captured the debate quite well. And we quote him in the concept note, but I'd like to quote him again in setting the tone for this discussion. I quote, "South Africa is trapped in the past, not by its constitution, but by the actions and inaction of politicians who the law never prevented from devising and implementing an effective plan for moving to a more equal future. This should help us place in perspective the claims of politicians who advance their ambitions by blaming a document for their indifference towards the people who elected them." End of quote. With that, we enter the discussion immediately, and I invite L.B. Sachs.
Thank you, Ibo, and hi to many of you whom I haven't seen for quite a long time. And I promised the other participants that there'll be quite a few surprises in my presentation. I'm sure of that because although I was central to the story I'm going to tell, preparing for this and preparing for the run-up to this presentation, I encountered many surprises myself. And I'm going to start with 1979. L.B. Sachs still had two arms. It's December, and it's a very hot day in Maputo, Mozambique. And I've been invited by Oscar Monteiro, one of the Frelimo leaders, to attend the Central Committee meeting. I was very excited. Central Committee of Frelimo, which was effectively the government, because we were both, Oscar and myself, teaching law at the Faculty of Laws in Mozambique. And I'm wearing my safari suit. It had short sleeves. We didn't have collars and ties. And there I see Samora, and there may be 200 or so members of the Central Committee. The Portuguese is quite good. I'm hearing everything. I see Samora looking all the time to the back of the room. And the vivas and discussions, and he's looking to the back of the room, and somebody comes in with a piece of paper, a huge smile on his face. He says, finally, 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 at Lancaster House in London, the parties have agreed to a new constitution. The war is over, ceasefire, new constitution. And 200 members of the Central Committee stood up and sang beautifully and powerfully a song about Chimurenga. Very identified with it. And I started shivering. I was shivering because I was in an air-conditioned room. This was the old officers' mess of the Portuguese army, was now where the Central Committee met. It's the only cool place in Maputo. I'm shivering because it's cold, and I'm shivering because I'm so excited and I'm so sad. We were the first in South Africa, 1912, the ANC set up, and now we're the last. Zimbabwe getting independence. When will it be our turn? So it was a moment of huge breakthrough and great meaning. And yet Lancaster House became the symbol of everything we didn't want in South Africa. And in a way, I think it's part of the foundation of today's discussion. In South Africa, our constitution, as I'll explain, has very deep roots in the struggle of the people. In the case of Zimbabwe, it was imposed by British lawyers wanting to get out of Zimbabwe. It was hated by the white minority rulers because it displaced them. It was hated by ZANU, it was hated by ZAPU. The only thing they had in common, they all hated that British-made constitution. And so it had no authority, no prestige. It was just a document that ended the war and provided for independence. Massively important historically, totally without importance. In fact, it's an ugly constitution, guaranteeing, I think it was 20 white seats, 4 whites in their parliament, no land reform for 10 years. It was everything a constitution shouldn't be. I move forward to 1985, conference in Kabwe, ANC, consultative conference. We're surrounded by Zambian troops in case commandos come from South Africa to take us all out. And we're discussing the 4 pillars of our struggle, which is the underground resistance, popular mobilization, international boycott, and armed struggle. Armed struggle being one of the pillars of struggle, but not the struggle. And quietly, Oliver Tambo is opening the possibilities of negotiations, not calling for it, but the possibilities. And quietly he sets up a think tank. It was actually called a secret think tank, the Constitution Committee. Professor Jack Simons, whom some of you might know, was the chair. Zolas Kuya was the deputy. Penwell Maduna was a member. Teddy Pekani, Jobs Jobotwana. Later on, we were joined by Bridget Mabandla, and from outside, myself and Kader Asmal. I don't think there's ever been a legal team quite like that in the world. And in a very wonderful book that Andre Odendaal is completing almost as I'm speaking now, called Dear Comrade President, how Oliver Tambo laid the foundations of South Africa's constitution. The story is told, and I'm going to pick up a few highlights of the particular role that Oliver Tambo played and the deep-rootedness in Africa and the African continent of our constitutional order. So in a way, it was a sense of the first shall be the last shall be the first. We were the first, we became the last, and now in some ways we become the first again. So I move forward to the Constitutional Committee meeting in Lusaka and deciding we base our constitution on the Freedom Charter, but we don't copy it. The Freedom Charter has to be converted from a document of principles and ideas and values into a functioning operational constitution document for the country. We decide as a matter of principle, we don't draft the constitution externally. Only the South African people can draft the constitution at a constituent assembly in South Africa. But we decide on certain key foundational principles that eventually, after a seminar, of which there's never been a seminar quite like that in the world, at the Zimbabwe University, the University in Lusaka, we decide on certain core guidelines. This will be our approach. And the key foundations came from a paper that Fellow Jordan delivered in 1985 before the Kabwe Conference to the National Executive, how to deal with future counter-revolution in South Africa. His position was, one day, not too far away, the whites are going to have to concede to universal franchise. And they're preparing their trenches to ensure that white domination is retained with black majority rule. And what is our answer? And he said the answer is not to go along with their power sharing ideas, group rights between whites, Afrikaners, Zulus, blacks. We would have ended up with 3 presidents, with Mandela on Monday and de Klerk on Tuesday and Buthelezi on Wednesday, having to agree by consensus. It would have entrenched white domination or white privilege in South Africa. He said, our answer to the group rights proposition is a Bill of Rights. And ANC had a Bill of Rights in 1923, had a Bill of Rights during African claims at the time of the Atlantic Charter. What about us in South Africa? Bill of Rights in 1944. The Freedom Charter was like a Bill of Rights. He said, that's our constitutional answer to the attempts to use what was called consociationism to maintain the division of South Africa. We all have rights under the Bill of Rights, not because we're majority, minority, black, white, or brown, because we're human beings. And that must be foundational to our project. So we had all these themes lined up. I move forward to Pluto Kinevali. That battle that was so decisive in terms of Southern African history, and certainly the story that follows from that. The Cubans defending Pluto Kinevali with Fatla, managing to give a bloody nose to the South African military. Their war is becoming unsustainable in Namibia. Now the Soviet Union, United States get involved, and there's a whole change in the climate, and pressure is being put on the ANC. You've got to negotiate. You can't use our countries anymore as bases. We'll kick you out if you don't find a settlement. And Oliver Tambo now takes the initiative. And he bases his initiative on Namibian experience, positive and negative. Lancaster House, negative. We don't want the United Nations to become involved. UNCTAD came to Namibia and took over the authority of Namibia because the United Nations under Western control will be trying to protect the interests of the whites. And they will say black majority rule, we have to have white minority protection, and that will seal the status quo. We don't, so that's what we don't want from Namibia. And we don't want the Lancaster House. We don't speak about black majority rule because then the answer is white minority protection. So that became foundational to his approach. And he said, we must take the initiative in negotiations. And the initiative took the form of what ultimately became called the Harare Declaration. which the ANC, it was Thabo Mbeki, was very involved, Benno Maduna, Oliver Tambo, Jack Simons contributed a little bit. A document produced in Lusaka for the whole process of negotiations to proceed in South Africa. And it laid down principles and conditions. We can't negotiate while our people are in prison. We can't negotiate while we don't have free political activity. We can't negotiate while the armored cars are in the townships. We can't negotiate while there isn't freedom to speak and to consult with our people. So negotiations became a lever for getting Mandela and others out of prison, to get unbanning of the organizations. But it also laid down a vision of a united, non-racial, democratic South Africa. And they flew with this document from to Angola, to Tanzania, down, ended up in Harare, Botswana, Harare, consulting to get African support for the document, so it wouldn't just be an ANC document, it would be an African document. And the most important discussions took place in Tanzania with Julius Nyerere, who said, it's a great document, I support it, but you're asking too much. You're asking the whites in South Africa to lay down their arms, hand over the government, surrender to your vision. Don't be so bold. Rather, set out principles that you want, like was happening in Namibia. Principles for the Namibian independence were agreed to in advance, and they became, so it's Julius Nyerere coming up with the ideas of certain principles being key to constitution making in South Africa. The document underwent certain changes, and Robert Mugabe was the last one they consulted, and he said, we're having a meeting of the OAU in Harare next week, and let's call it the Harare Declaration. And we'll take it to the OAU will adopt it. So the OAU adopted the Harare Declaration, which became foundational to our whole constitutional process and the core of our process. It was then picked up by the non-aligned movement, by the Commonwealth, even Margaret Thatcher had to submit to it, finally taken to the General Assembly, where Thabo and one other had to persuade everybody, meeting all the different blocks there, and it was accepted by acclamation. Now, this story is hardly known in South Africa, hardly known in the world, hardly known in Africa. Yet Africa was central to our achievement of our new constitutional order. Because if you see what de Klerk did afterwards, he was boxed in, and he had to release the political prisoners, allow exiles to return, take the troops out of the townships, and allow free political activity. The other aspect that we battled over also was who would write the constitution, and we insisted on constituent assembly in South Africa. Constitution making process was very frazzled. It had breakdowns. Chris Hani was assassinated. We had rolling mass action. There were threats of 40,000 armed whites seizing power. We had problems with the Inkatha Freedom Party in KwaZulu-Natal. It wasn't an easy ride. It wasn't a simple compact that was produced between Mandela and a few capitalists and a few politicians, on the contrary. And the two-stage process of constitution making gave birth to the Constitution Court, because the breakthrough in negotiations came through when the regime was compelled by the rolling mass action, by the huge support for change in South Africa, by the clarity and position of our views and international support giving us more and more support, to capitulate and agree that we wouldn't write the constitution by the negotiations. We had to have elections to produce the body to write the constitution. And if you look at the interim constitution and the final constitution, The interim constitution was there to give us elections and the final constitution, with a few nice themes in a limited Bill of Rights. The final constitution was not negotiated around a table. It was produced by 490 members of parliament. The majority of them had been in prison, in jail, in exile, they'd known torture. The theme of freedom and never again was very, very powerful. The theme of dealing with the gross economic disparities in our country was very, very powerful. But also the theme of we're not simply planning to achieve power, because we'd seen bad things happen in the countries we'd lived in Africa and other parts of the world, and outside our own organization. We wanted a constitution in that sense against ourselves. And that's why we ended up with what many regard as the finest, most progressive constitution in the world. It wasn't because we had clever lawyers. It's because we had lawyers in the struggle and lawyers outside the struggle who could find the language, but the spirit and the thrust of our constitution came from struggle and also this desire to have a country where everybody could live in as equals with dignity. This wasn't a concession. This is what we wanted. We didn't want a country of dominators and dominated and so on. We wanted a country, this was the deep belief of Oliver Tambo. We African people who suffered so much in our skins for being who we are, we will prove to the world it is possible for people of different cultures and backgrounds and races and beliefs to live together. That was a source of pride for him. Then who was to decide, once we'd agreed on the constitution-making body would be the new parliament, we agreed on the principles in advance. And these were principles that we were fighting for. They were negative principles. There's nothing that says there shan't be any economic transformation or change. There's nothing in the principles about that. We wanted a separation of powers. We wanted an independent judiciary. We wanted a lively free press. We wanted freedom of movement. These are things that we wanted, and these were embodied in the principles. But the parliament, sitting as a constitutional assembly, had to adopt a constitution within 2 years in keeping with those principles. And who was to decide if the principles had been agreed to? Couldn't be parliament itself. So it was decided to have a constitutional court. Primary function, to determine if the constitution was constitutional. Secondary function, to serve as a constitutional court in the interim period while the final constitution is being preserved, being debated, to promote fundamental rights in that period. So the constitutional court then received the document. We had 10 days of challenges to the document, of people saying the principles weren't adhered to from 70 different parties. And in the end, we upheld 10 changes. Overwhelmingly, Parliament, sitting as Constitutional Assembly, had done its job. We approved overwhelmingly, but in 10 respects, we found it failed. We sent it back to Parliament. We declared the Constitution to be unconstitutional. The Constitutional Assembly made the corrections, and on December the 6th, I think it was, 1996, we certified it was okay, and December the 10th, 1996, at Sharpeville, Nelson Mandela signed the Constitution into law. Now, it's so different from Lancaster, and it meant the Constitution has an embedded, meaningful quality in South Africa that the Lancaster House Constitution never had. And the Constitutional Court, very carefully chosen, consisted of people who had all resisted apartheid. Now, I think there was a court in Zimbabwe that had some of those elements in the post-constitutional era. And when we on the court were established, we cited Dumbachena, Gabe, and others in Zimbabwe for very progressive, forward-looking, thoughtful decisions. And it was very painful to see how through what looked like thuggery and threats after Dumbachena died, Gabe was forced out, he left, and what had been a very strong and meaningful institution in Zimbabwe. Nobody cites their decisions today throughout anywhere in the world. It doesn't have prestige as far as I can see. I don't like to speak badly about colleagues in a sister country, but it hasn't become a beacon of anything positive in Zimbabwe. Just two more things before I conclude. Our court, from the beginning, decided, we didn't use the term decolonize, but we decided, first point was, we're not going to be called my lord, my lady anymore, or honorable. You think it's a small thing, but it became huge in South Africa. To this day, the other courts still speak by my lord, my lady. We decided to drop that. And we decided not to use Latin, despite the Roman Dutch law. We decided that the court would be seated at a level where counsel's eyes were the same height as ours. We're not sitting up there. We decided to rotate our seating so that there's no hierarchy in the court. We decided to have workshops to discuss the cases as they came. We go round and round the table several times and change and so on. We changed because so many of us had been in struggle, we were used to discussion, we were used to workshops. It was natural to us. Why shouldn't it be? And we had people like Arthur Traskelson, Ishmael Mohammed, Pius Langer, being maybe the three key people, and wonderful colleagues from the old judiciary who'd hated apartheid, who now felt liberated and were able to contribute enormously to the richness of the tapestry that we were creating. So it was a court in that sense, totally in line with the Constitution, with the values of a Constitution that was a very value-laden Constitution, speaking about the injustices of the past, speaking about change, the need for transformation and change. We invented the word transformation, in fact, in South African lexicon, came from the Constitutional Court to summarize the nature of our Constitution. And when it came to putting up a building, we chose the site of the old Fort Prison, where we say with a dubious pride, we have the only jail in the world where Gandhi and Mandela and Albert Luthuli and Robert Sobukwe and Winnie Mandela and Fatima Mir and all the others were locked up. We have that prison, and that's where we put our court. And the court's built on the principle of justice under a tree, the traditional African way of settling disputes. We didn't say decolonize, decolonize. We decolonized in our own minds because that was what we wanted. We fought hard for our own constitution. We wanted our own building, representing our own style and our own aesthetic. And the decisions of the court were admired by the people, even if there was no jumping for joy in the streets when we struck down capital punishment, even if many people found it hard to accept homosexual love. They respected the fact that we explained our decisions. We gave a hearing to everybody, and we gave reasons with a kind of judicial emotion to justify the decisions that we were presenting. So I'd say the court, in that sense, particularly the Constitutional Court, if not all the levels of the judiciary, established a reputation, not just internationally, but internally, for seriousness, for integrity, for feeling, for being linked to the people. We put in interpretation booths in the Constitutional Court building. People have the right to use any of the languages. If you look outside, you'll see the name of the Constitutional Court in the 11 official languages. A whole series of features like that, because that's what we wanted. We want everybody to feel welcome there. Some of the most important cases dealt with social and economic rights, which deal specifically with the gap between the broad aims of the Constitution, the promise it makes, and the lived realities of ordinary people. And it shifted the judicial gaze from protecting property and power to the poor, the vulnerable. And you'll find that in the decisions all the way through. So these are all factors that have given the court an entrenchment, a rootedness in South African society, and a certain level of prestige. I remember the leader of the EFF saying that I'm not scared of Jacob Zuma. The only thing I'm scared of is the Constitutional Court. And he took a case to the Constitutional Court and won that case against Jacob Zuma at that stage. So at different stages, different parties, different people have been there, have had their victories, have had their defeats. And so the verbal attack on the court in that sense was extremely distressing to all of us who've been involved in that project. The physical attack where somebody went with a hammer was, I'd say, equally clumsy, and I'd like to believe equally unsuccessful in bringing that edifice down. So the final point is that looking to Africa, I spent 15 months in Kenya as a member of the Kenya Judicial Judges and Magistrates Vetting Board at a time of transformation there, transformation coming about through a new constitution and getting a new court. And the constitution and the court having a lot of prestige. It's a difficult country. It's a very difficult process, removing colleagues of our judges for twisting the law in ways to protect power. But the Kenyan courts produced a number of brilliant judges. Malawi court recently, not too long ago, was felt strong enough to challenge elections. The Kenyan court also challenged elections. I've just received a note from Rwanda. They want to hear more about the South African experience. And we have links of these kinds, I think, are extremely important in Africa. Important for, we used to feel, for the moral, if you like, jurisprudential strength that we developed on constitutional head in Johannesburg to provide support to democratic, forward-looking judges and people in other parts of the continent. And now maybe a little bit of solidarity coming back to us will also be welcome. So I'd just like to mention the book, not simply for the sake of doing a plug for a book that I have quite a big hand in helping to produce, but it's Andre Odendaal. We're hoping it will come out in April. It's called Dear Comrade President, because we noticed we would write letters. Dear Comrade President, at one stage, one chapter is headed with a Comrade King Dalinyebo, please come to the microphone. It shows all the contradictions of developing a constitution at the heart of a revolutionary struggle and movement. It's beautifully written, it's evidence-based, and it's going to, I believe, completely recast the story of how the South African Constitution came into being and prove that it was very much an African document, not only because of the leadership of people like Tambo and Pallo and others, intellectual leadership, and the traditions going back, but also because of the support that we got through the Harare Declaration, through people like Julius Nyerere and Kenneth Cohen in particular, Samora Machel in a different way in Mozambique, and at a late stage from Robert Mugabe. All of these factors contributed enormously to our achievement of the constitutional order in South Africa. We are embedded in the African continent, and our destinies are so much tied to it. It grieves me so much knowing that a Mozambican died through the bomb that was meant to kill me, to see the times when our people become xenophobic and blame Mozambicans or Zimbabweans or somebody else for our problems. So this particular conference discussion has a significance that I think is quite profound, and you're dealing with deeply rooted issues of emotion, of history, of episodes, of documents. And I'm looking forward very much to hearing the other speakers.
Thanks, Albie. Thanks very much for that profound presentation. Touch of history, the transition from apartheid to democracy in 1994, represented in part by the constitutional process as well. You said, and we agree, the finest and the most progressive constitution, not only in Africa, but elsewhere in the world. It is value laden. It speaks of transformation. But we'll agree, and it's a verse, there's nothing, I quote you, there's nothing in the principles that is averse to economic transformation. And yet the debate, which has been sparked by Lindiwe Sisulu, speaks to the gap between the ideal, that is the constitution, on the one hand, and the living reality of the mass of the people in South Africa. Looking back, in retrospect, are there any areas of the constitution that you think would have written differently? Especially if we have to accept, as we should, that both the transition to 1994 and the constitution itself largely speaks to a compromise, an inevitable historical compromise, given the circumstances of the struggle against apartheid, against wet state colonialism in Southern Africa generally. What would you try differently? And how would you address this yawning gap between the ideal and the living reality of the mass of the people 25, 26 years after the war?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. If you don't mind, I'll turn your question into two questions. The one is, what would we have done differently?
Yes.
Looking back retrospectively. And there's nothing in the Constitution that I feel, it would be very unjudicial. Oh shit, I wish we hadn't done that. There's nothing like that at all.
Okay.
There's no, but I want to go beyond that. I don't like the word compromise. It wasn't a compromise. It was a compromise means you give in on principle for the sake of it. It was what I call an accommodation. An accommodation because it was one of our principles to make South Africa a country everybody could feel they could live in. That wasn't a compromise. And to open the door to transformation and change. Land reform was seen as a huge issue. And we opened the door for that. It's there, it's in the Constitution to permit that. And then we were proud of the sexual orientation clause, the first in the world. We were proud of the environmental clause, the first in the world. We were proud of social and economic rights, the first in Commonwealth countries to have anything like that. We were proud of so many other aspects. At the institutional level, I would have, in a chapter 9, where we now have, and this is unique in the world, to have a chapter in the Constitution to defend basic institutions that defend the Constitution. Independent Electoral Commission is there, Judicial Service Commission is there, the Auditor General is there, Commission for Human Rights is there, Commission for Gender Equality is there, and there's some more. And they're given special protection. Now looking back, I wish we had an anti-corruption commission built in from the beginning. It's easy to say that now, but we knew of the dangers of corruption. We'd had corruption, not big, small in our own organization, but we'd seen it big in countries we'd lived in. But we didn't see that we saw that as a political issue. That's the only change. We were forced to have more provinces than we would have liked, and maybe bigger provincial governments that don't play a very significant role. We would have preferred strong national government and larger local governments without the intermediary thing. But I can't say, but we wouldn't have got it without KwaZulu-Natal having some degree of autonomy, the Western Cape similar. In terms of the gaps,
in the ideal, the reality.
Yes. Well, first of all, reality has changed. It's wrong to say nothing's changed. You just walk down the street, it's different. Before, even the body language of people on the pavements, the service in the shops, all of these things, it took some time. And we've got used to black government. And one of the big objectives of the Tambo Mandela generation was to say democracy works in Africa and does provide a better life for everybody in Africa. And we African people want democracy. We believe in it. It's the whites who have Bantustans and separation can't agree. And we want it to work. And we don't want the counter-revolutionaries, as Paulo called them, to be able to say, you get democracy, one person, one vote once, everything breaks down. The factories stop running, people go hungry, food isn't being produced, the trains don't work anymore, things like that. So in that sense, the importance of keeping the machinery of the economy going was seen as, if you like, part of African pride. That we can manage, that we can learn, that we can provide the leadership. And one of the saddest things for me in recent months is hearing people now saying they're not sure about that. You know, maybe it was better under the whites, things functioned then. It was better, maybe we African people can't rule. It's deeply painful. But that was a great success, the transition in that sense. Even Mandela putting on the rugby jersey, he knew what he was doing. He wasn't just being nice to the whites. The whites still had the guns, they ran the administration, the public service, and a little gesture like that would make them less recalcitrant, less obstructionist, less likely to take up arms, you know, to resist us. And the fact that 4 million people have got homes free. They're not wonderful homes, and there's been corruption in the distribution. But that means something like 16 million people have moved from shacks into homes with electricity, water, sewage. The fact that something like 16 million people, a quarter of the population, receive social assistance. I don't know what it's like in Zimbabwe, but it's very meaningful to the desperately poor. Even if we have the biggest Gini coefficient in the world, that's based on income. But if you take the social income into account, the figures, I think, would come out very, very differently.
Oh, thanks, Albie.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I should just note that this program is recorded, it will be transcribed and published, and you'll be getting a copy of that. So I think you've given us.
Can I just say that there's masses of stuff that's absolutely intolerable in South Africa now, and we've shot ourselves in the foot so many times we run out of feet to shoot ourselves in. So I don't want to point to positives, and the biggest positives are we have regular elections. We don't have tanks going into the streets to bring about a regime change. Our president stepped down because they're going to be voted out of office. That's huge. And it's very meaningful and very relevant to the discussion with Zimbabwe.
Very important.
But the status quo is unacceptable.
That's a very important and profound statement, Albie. And I think now we move on. I must apologize to the other panelists. I thought we'd engage Albie. It's not often that we have him. So I think, but he has given us some rich material to discuss and debate. And I now call on Luando to join in the debate. Luando.
Hi, Ibo. I didn't come prepared to debate anyone. I just wanted to make a few remarks, and hopefully I won't be too long. If I am, just give me a sign. And hi, Alvi, good to see you. Hi, everyone, good evening. I just want to talk about the role that the judiciary plays in strengthening our constitutional democracy. You know, I was taken to one of the lowest moments of our constitutional democracy, which was in 2017, when due to the government's self-created nightmare, it was in danger of not being able to pay social grants to approximately 17 million of our people. A couple of years before that, the Constitutional Court had invalidated the government's tender process, appointing a private party to distribute social grants. And at that time, that tender was one of the biggest tenders in our history, but it was riddled with irregularities. And it would be the most impoverished amongst us who would bear the consequences. In the interest of the people and in the face of a neglectful government, the court suspended the invalidity of the tender contract until the 30th of May 2017 to ensure that there would be no disruption to the payment of social grants and to give the government sufficient time to rerun the tender process. The government decided that it would not rerun the tender process, but instead it opted to take over the payment of social grants itself. As the deadline, the 30th of March 2017 approached, it became very clear that the government had not taken the necessary steps to ensure that it could pay social grants. The government's poor planning placed the court between a rock and a hard place. It either had to extend a now expired unlawful contract, or it had to make sure that the government paid, you know, the social grants and not jeopardize the lives of 17 million people. It was a disgraceful set of facts. It was also the kind of facts that unnecessarily burdened the court, because if the government had done its job diligently, these facts would not have arisen. Once again, the court had to act as a janitor and clean up. And it did that by having to extend an unlawful contract and appointing itself, the court appointed itself as a supervisor of the South African Social Security Agency to make sure that it did its job. This is a position that no court ever wants to be in, but there was no other choice. The court neither created this crisis, nor had it brought this matter to itself, nor was it the one that had failed to implement the remedial action prescribed earlier of rerunning the tender, which would have saved the country from these regretful circumstances. If we feel today that the court is far too dominant of an institution in our constitutional democracy, whose fault is that? In reaction to the court's decisions over the years, politicians and the members of the government have accused the judges of being traitors of our democratic cause as counter-revolutionaries. You know, I have to tell you that that case emotionally affected me. The idea that 17 million people who depend on those grants may not be able to get them. I had to ask, who is the counter-revolutionary in those circumstances? Would our constitutional democracy have been stronger or weaker if the court had simply folded its hands and said that this was not a matter in which it could engage? Last year, the entire world watched as lawless citizens stormed the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And in reaction to that scene, this is what I wrote. Here in South Africa, I have watched in shame as our parliamentarians have physically brawled and fought each other in parliament, a space to me that is supposed to exemplify dignified discourse. I have watched our politicians use language that betrays our founding values. I have watched thugs masquerading as servants of the people while they plunder and violate every line of the preamble of our Constitution. I would like to say to our leaders that I hope this incident, the storming of the Capitol, shows you why the rule of law is critical to the survival of any country. I hope it shows you why polarization is a danger, not only to the country, but to you too. The rule of law which you violate with impunity will one day fail to protect you as your subjects storm your chambers. I hope this incident shows you that the problem starts with you. I don't want to pathologize Africa. Attacks against the judiciary happen across the world, from the US to New Zealand to the UK, when the judges in the UK were branded as enemies of the people when they made a ruling on the UK leaving the EU, defying the vote of 17 million people in favor of Brexit. But for a young democracy like ours, this kind of attack against the judiciary can cause irreparable harm. In her Helen Suzman lecture in 2011, Justice O'Regan said, "We should not immediately be alarmed when debates about the proper ambit of judicial power arises. It is a debate that is endemic in democracies. The questions of the proper role of the courts and the Constitutional Court is a recurring question in our democracy." End quote. Constitutionalism is a discourse that needs critical perspectives, but let us not mistake political manipulation as progressive constitutional discourse. It is not, it is deception. As a people, we have been deceived too long by leaders who amplify harmful rhetoric, not to change the status quo, but for their own political ends. Justice O'Regan also said that the corollary of constitutional supremacy is a strong form of judicial review, which permits our courts, and again, particularly the Constitutional Court, to determine what conduct is consistent with the Constitution. A further logical consequence of constitutional supremacy is that a court, when deciding a constitutional matter within its powers, must declare the law or conduct that is inconsistent with the Constitution to be valid or invalid to the extent of its inconsistency. A governance model without judicial review would be akin to the apartheid regime, which sought a biased and compliant judiciary, under which the judges were appointed by the president on the direction of the Minister of Justice, and not by a rigorous and independent body like the JSC today. This is a quote by the secret barrister in the UK. He says, "Judicial review is what protects us, the individual, from the overbearing might of the state. It exists to ensure that however venal, corrupt, or malign the politicians who govern us, we are treated equally and according to the law. The government's claims to be restoring trust in democracy by rolling back these checks and balances masks an audacious power grab, allowing them to govern unlawfully and without accountability. If we lose judicial independence, we lose the rule of law. The day a judge makes a binding decision affecting the rights and liberties of one of us, not on the legal and factual merits, but with a nervous glance to the press and the public galleries, or with a beady eye on political favor or punishment, is the day that the decay in our democracy turns terminal. The work of the court places it in a position to overturn the decision of a government elected by the people in order to uphold the Constitution. If the rules of the Constitution could routinely be overridden by acts of parliament passed with a majority, the Constitution would effectively be rendered meaningless. This could have implications for minority groups that are not represented by the majority in parliament, but those who seek the protection of the Constitution and the government. And here, when I refer to minorities, I not only refer to white people, I refer to myself as a woman. I refer to members of the LGBTQIA community. I refer to religious minorities and other minority groups that have benefited from the court's decisions and the Constitution's protection. Eshad Cohen writes that a counter-majoritarian dilemma arises when an unelected body like the Constitutional Court overturns the rulings of an elected government. In effect, this means that 11 justices of the Constitutional Court can tell the majority of South Africans that their wishes are invalid. Is that okay? This seems to run counter to the basic premise of democracy. However, it is a necessary tenet of a constitutional democracy. The will of the majority cannot be the only factor to be considered. As then president of the Constitutional Court put it, Arthur Chastelson, he said, If public opinion were to be decisive, there would be no need for constitutional adjudication. The protection of rights could then be left to Parliament, which has a mandate from the public and is answerable to the public for the way its mandate is exercised. But this would be a return to parliamentary sovereignty and would also lead to tyranny by the majority. That is my part at the end, the tyranny of the majority. With the deliberate weakening of other structures and institutions meant to support our constitutional democracy, and with the rise of extreme polarization of political parties rendering them unable to talk to each other, the courts, particularly the Constitutional Court, are overburdened. When other institutions of democracy fail to respond to matters such as corruption, the courts have the tendency to move in and fill the vacuum. The courts become a rallying point in the democratic process. Those are the words of Jeff Budlinder. Of course, the courts are aware of this predicament that they're in, and as a result have largely approached their work with caution. Jeff Budlinder pointed out that our courts repeatedly and rightly draw attention to the need for judges to approach policy questions with some respect. They repeatedly and rightly point out that in these cases, the question for the court is not whether the policy is right or whether it is the best policy, but whether it is a policy which is permissible under the Constitution. They repeatedly and rightly point out that the executive has advantages that the courts do not have in dealing with questions of policy choice. The executive is the one that has specialist knowledge, not them, and experience. They can have access to a wide range of advice. They are not limited to the materials and the arguments between the parties before the court. In an eviction matter between the local government and the occupants of a rundown building, which reached the Constitutional Court a number of years ago, instead of deciding the matter itself, the Constitutional Court made the following order. It asked the parties to engage with each other meaningfully, and as soon as it is possible for them to do so, in an effort to resolve the differences and difficulties aired in the matter in the light of the values of the Constitution. The constitutional and statutory duties of the municipality and the rights and duties of the citizens concerned had to be balanced. This is one of the judgments that a lot of people don't know about, where the court has expressed the fact that it doesn't always want to intervene in these matters. It wants parties to be able to talk to each other. And this order was quite successful because the parties went back, to negotiating and were able to resolve the matter themselves. The court's direction was able to strengthen the relationship between citizen and government and underscore our forgotten ability to engage with each other outside of the courtroom. Jeff Budlinder also commented that what the court order did was open up the process of participation in our democracy. People who were powerless became powerful because they were the holders of rights and were treated accordingly. They became citizens and not subjects. This order revealed to me how self-aware the court is. It is a court that desires to promote and deepen democracy rather than impede it. And these are my concluding remarks. Many experts have written about the failures of liberal constitutionalism on our continent, that the normative ideas of constitutionalism rooted in our colonial past are unsuitable for Africa. As much as these critical perspectives need to be seriously engaged, we cannot deny that despotic leaders and corruption have caused greater harm. The courts are just one of the means available to us as ordinary citizens to hold our government accountable. Jeff Budlinder also wrote that one of the most important mechanisms through which accountability is exercised is the court. It is important to recognize that while the courts are a critical mechanism of accountability, that accountability is not to the court, it's to the people. Courts deepen democracy by holding power accountable. The courts enable the people to insist that those who exercise power, whether public or private, account for their conduct and justify it. So in conclusion, I want to say that years of trying to tear down our judiciary are starting to show in very real ways. Last July, the Constitutional Court was flanked by an army of police vehicles, and judges needed to have personal security and protection. Not only are we endangering our democracy, we are endangering the lives of real people, the judges and the staff members of the Constitutional Court. Reckless words have consequences. Judges need the ability to call it as they see it, to be faithful to the law without fear, and these attacks threaten that imperative. Decisional independence is key. Judges and courts have to model critical thinking and healthy democratic dialogue by listening to all sides dispassionately, even-handedly. Where Parliament has become a sideshow, the courts still model behavior that we should aspire to. Whether the judiciary is revered or reviled, it must persist without fear, favor, and prejudice. Politicians being frustrated by the courts is a sign of a healthy constitutional democracy. And that's all I have to say. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Luando. A compelling defense of the courts and a fascinating case study on the role of the Constitution in protecting the poor and the vulnerable. The court is a rallying point in the democratic process. We've made a very strong case. We feel convinced. Thanks very much, Luando. Thank you. Move on to Aubrey Mashiki. Aubrey.
Good evening.
Hi, Aubrey.
Let me say right at the outset that Chair, feel free to stop me when you run out of patience because I speak slowly. So you are likely to run out of patience at some point. I want to start with an act of theft. I want to steal from Stephen Friedman first, and then steal from George Orwell. Not in what is quoted in the concept note, but elsewhere and several times, Stephen Friedman has argued that South Africa is a society of outsiders and insiders. I will add two things to that, out of the many things I would like to add to the statement. Firstly, that the outsiders are in the majority. And secondly, in making this statement, Stephen Friedman is talking about all countries in the world without exception. Therefore, there is no country in the world that cannot be described as a society of insiders and outsiders. In the context of South Africa, one of the ways in which we create a majority of outsiders is through language, official languages, English and its 10 bridesmaids. And therefore, social, political, economic, and other realities tend to be reflected through the medium of English. Worse, there are some among us who seem to think that to speak in English, to opine in English, is to be rational. And not to do so is to be irrational, which means the majority of South Africans are irrational because they do not engage with social, economic, cultural, political, and other realities through English. So to the extent that language excludes so many in this country. Stephen Friedman is right that our society is a society of insiders and outsiders. It is a society of insiders and outsiders in other ways, politically, socially, economically, culturally, and otherwise. And that ours is a so-called constitutional democracy doesn't change that. It doesn't change the fact that in this constitutional democracy, the majority of citizens are outsiders. George Orwell once said that just because one lives in a democracy does not mean that one will not be subjected to authoritarianism. Some of this authoritarianism we have seen in the debate about the article authored by our tourism minister, Lindiwe Sisulu, in support of what she said. And in criticizing what she said in the article. We have seen something I always say about these debates, that every cause, no matter how noble, has its tyrants. And I have seen tyrants, I've heard tyrants on both sides of the debate about the article that was written by Lindiwe Sisulu. That said, like Luanda, I'm not here to agree or disagree with anyone. I'm here not to argue in defense of specific formulations in our constitution. I'm not here to attack specific formulations in our constitution. I'm here to talk about one thing and one thing only. I'm here to talk about where this constitution comes from, and therefore where our constitutional order itself comes from. Today, that's the only argument I'm interested in sharing. Let me start by saying that my primary authority is my relationship with my ancestors. And when I talk about ancestors, I'm talking about two things. I'm talking about a historical fact. The historical fact that there were people who were there before us, who were on this planet before us. But when I talk about they are no longer here, I am therefore talking about them as spirit. And hence, I want to start by saying that my primary authority is my relationship with my ancestors. When I talk about my ancestors as a historical fact, as those who were here before us, I am reminded of the words of Walter Mignolo when he talks about the darker side of Western modernity. And he says that the darker side of Western modernity is coloniality, a logic which gives us colonialism. Now, in passing, let me make 2 points. First of all, that colonialism in a formal sense may be gone, but the coloniality, the logic which gives us colonialism is still very much alive. And secondly, when it comes to South Africa is a country in Africa, but is not an African country. It is a country that is governed quite firmly, still, by the logic of coloniality. And one of the challenges we face in our neo-apartheid reality is that too many amongst those who govern us, particularly in our ruling party, have become allies to and of coloniality. But these are 2 points I'm making in passing. Let me go back to the point I was making about Walter Mignolo, the darker side of Western modernity, and the logic of coloniality, which gives us colonialism. So when I talk about my ancestors, I'm reminded of the fact that one of the questions which comes with the European period of enlightenment, a period which was quite dark in some ways, is a question about those who are not European, a question about those who are not white and European. A question which the logic of coloniality answers in this way, in 2 ways. Firstly, those who are not European, who are not white and European, are epistemologically inferior, incapable, therefore, of creating and grasping knowledge. Secondly, they are ontologically inferior. In other words, they are not human if they are. They are not as human as those who are European and white. This is the logic which gave us the colonialism that so much suffering was visited upon my ancestors. As a result of the same colonialism, manifests partly as apartheid colonialism later in history. What happens is that, as I always say, those who are a numerical minority have become a cultural majority whose worldview, whose ways of seeing, whose ways of being, whose ways of doing have become the dominant reality. And those who are a numerical majority have become a cultural minority. And before I continue, let me make this point about the Constitution. Every constitution in every country in the world that has adopted a constitution represents the triumph of a particular worldview. It is a product over time of battles and conflicts between contending worldviews. And therefore the adoption of a constitution in any country, anywhere in the world, represents the triumph of a particular worldview. The South African Constitution is no exception in this regard, the South African Constitution represents the triumph of a particular worldview. And to the fact that you can talk about subsets of a particular worldview. You can talk about our constitutional order as a subset of the worldview that has given birth to it. And therefore, no, I'm sorry, you can talk about it as the triumph, yes, of a worldview that has given birth to it. And this takes me back to where I started when I talk about my ancestors, the victims of colonialism. That what happens with a dismembering from who they are dismembered from their relationship with the self, they are dismembered from their relationship with the land, they are dismembered from their essence, their spirit, and they are dismembered from their relationship with their ancestors. They are dismembered from their relationship with what they understand to be God. Therefore, to talk about colonialism is to talk about the colonization of all these areas of their being. And therefore, to talk about decolonization is to talk about the remembering of all these areas of our being. In this regard, the South African Constitution will never be enough because itself, as a representative of a triumph of a particular worldview, and one of the components of this worldview being whiteness, and here I'm not talking about skin color, I'm talking about ways of seeing, ways of being, ways of doing, and the worldview. Therefore, the Constitution itself, in part, is a product of this worldview, as I Chair.
No, just saying you wind up. Yes.
Okay. And therefore, if we accept that the South African Constitution and any constitution in the world, including the Zimbabwean Constitution, represent the triumph of a particular worldview, we must accept something else. We must accept that the struggle against apartheid colonialism was a struggle for the creation of a society that is the antithesis of apartheid society. Having accepted that, we must accept something more challenging, that the creation of a society that is the antithesis of apartheid society is itself not an end. Then we must accept that once such a society is accepted, what begins is another task. The task of creating a society that is the antithesis of the very society that is the antithesis of apartheid society. If you accept that, then you must accept that this task is an eternal task. And if you accept that, you must accept that the task of renewing our society is a never-ending task itself. And if you accept that, you must constitutional order, and therefore the constitution is itself a never-ending task. It must be a never-ending task because words are not what they describe. The word cat is not a cat. The words in the Constitution are not what they describe. It is a never-ending task because we must bridge the gap between the words of the Constitution and the reality it seeks to describe. Thokoza.
Thanks, Aubrey. A heavy intervention, the logic of coloniality. The Constitution reflects a worldview, perhaps also an epoch, a class question. Stephen Friedman, maybe you want to respond to those very powerful words from Aubrey in the course of your presentation. I apologize again for the time, but we should not feel constrained by time. We can go beyond 7:30. This is a very important discussion. Yes, well, Stephen.
I'll try to keep the time anyway. But probably academic time rather than human time. So I'll try and make concessions to human time. Look, you've heard a bit about what I have to say about this issue, both from the quote that you used and from the comments Aubrey made. But just to put this in context, and I hope this doesn't come across as a plug, but it's an explanation. The article I wrote in response to Minister Sisulu was actually based very heavily on a chapter in my book, Prisoners of the Past, which came out in the middle of last year, and which makes the argument that Aubrey was referring to, that post-apartheid South Africa is still divided between insiders and outsiders. And that in turn is part of a bigger problem. And the bigger problem is that a lot of the patterns of pre-1994 South Africa are still very visible and still very deeply embedded in the society, of which the division between insiders and outsiders is one. And Aubrey is absolutely correct to say that there are divisions between insiders and outsiders in every society. But I think that the disturbing feature of South Africa's divisions is that they approximate very largely to the kind of divisions which existed under apartheid, with important differences. And when I say that, I'm not disagreeing with the point. In fact, I argue the point very strongly in the book that I'm not taking the view that nothing has changed. A great deal has changed. What I am saying is that certain underlying patterns have not changed, and that those patterns describe some of the symptoms, if you like, of what the country is going through at the moment. But of course, you didn't ask me yet to talk about the argument in the book. You asked me to talk about the Constitution. And there is a chapter in the book on the Constitution in which I engage with a range of legal scholars and former judges, etc., on this issue. And to some extent, the argument is probably not that relevant to Zimbabwe's situation today, but on another extent, I think that it's very relevant. Now, although most of the chapter is a defensive of, or is critical of people who blame the Constitution, as my article was, I am not what Feroz Kachalia, a legal scholar who I quote at some length in the article, calls a constitutional triumphalist or a constitutional fetishist. I'm not one of those people who argue that we have an absolutely model constitution which has solved all the problems which constitutions are supposed to solve. I don't really enter that debate. I mean, I would, for example, want to debate very vigorously some of the things that Luanda Kaso had to say, because I do think that, and that's not an argument against constitutional democracy, but I do think that there are problems about the assumption that the judicial process can fix problems which politics can't fix. So that's why I'm not a constitutional fetishist, because I believe that ultimately problems are solved or not solved in democratic societies by democratic politics, and that constitutions are obviously, democratic constitutions are obviously essential to democratic politics, but they're not a substitute for democratic politics. So to illustrate this in very concrete terms, which sometimes upsets people who probably are close to constitutional fetishists, one of the most, and justifiably so, one of the most important social and economic rights cases which our constitutional court has pronounced over was the Grootboom case. And the Grootboom case concerned the rights of homeless people to housing. And it was so named because the lead plaintiff was a woman called Irene Grootboom. And the case was won, and the rights of people to decent housing were established in that case. Sadly, Mrs. Grootboom herself died without receiving. The process should have given her a house, but it does to me illustrate the point that I'm making, that there are limits to constitutional processes. Whether Mrs. Grootboom got a house or not depended on political factors, which sadly did not move in her favor, and social factors, which were even more stacked against her. It has to do with, to a certain extent, with power, to a large extent with power. And Mrs. Grootboom sadly was not among those South Africans who wield power. So the point of the argument is not to say, look, we have, we have this lifesaver which we must hold on to at all costs. I do think we must hold on to it. I do think that it supports our democratic rights. But I'm simply asking for a sense of perspective about this and an understanding that, once again, to quote Kachalia, these matters are settled by democratic politics, or should be settled by democratic politics. But by far the bulk, and that came across very clearly in the article which you were kind enough to quote, by far the bulk of my argument is a response to academic colleagues who seem to feel that the Constitution is the problem. So in other words, if you go back to what I said a few moments ago about the fact that we're divided into insiders and outsiders, the Constitution is the cause of that. I think implicitly most of what L.B. Sachs had to say was a response to that, and there's no need to repeat some of the points which were made. But clearly what he was responding to was the idea that this was an unacceptable compromise, that the reason that we have the divisions and the survival of the past that we do have was the fault of the Constitution. Now, I'm afraid that there's simply no evidence to support the view that our current problems are the fault of the Constitution. Because the point that I continually make when colleagues raise this point is, could you please point me to the clause in the Constitution which prevents change? Can you maybe show me the clause in the Constitution which prevents us dealing with this insider-outsider division in a way which doesn't, as Aubrey has pointed out, get rid of it entirely, but at least minimizes it or reduces it? And the answer I'm always given, and not only directly, but in what people write about this issue, is Section 25 of the Constitution. Now Section 25 of the Constitution is the property clause, and it entrenches the right to property, and it says in effect that you cannot deprive people of their property unlawfully. So the argument is obviously made that the property clause rewards ill-gotten gains. It rewards the theft of land by the colonizer of the colonized, and that it is therefore a block to change because you cannot make the social and economic changes that you would need to make because of the property clause. Now, the problem with this is that the property clause is, like all the other rights in the Constitution, subject to what is called the limitation clause. And obviously you don't need a non-lawyer like me to give you a lecture on the ins and outs of the Constitution. But in effect, the limitation clause says that you can override, in effect, any right in the Constitution, as long as you can show that by doing that, what your action is consistent with the values of a democratic society. Now, clearly, it should be pretty straightforward to demonstrate that attempts to alter the power balances, the economic power balances, which apartheid bequeathed us, is consistent with democracy. And therefore, that in itself means that the Constitution is not a block. Secondly, within Section 25 itself is Section 25(8), which for some reason seems to be entirely ignored in the debate. And Section 25(8) says that much of the property clause says that you can't deprive a person of property without just compensation or without appropriate compensation. And Section 25 says that you can override this if you're doing it in order to rectify past racial injustices, which of course is the whole point of trying to override those particular property rights. So in other words, the Constitution does not prevent any political initiative which is designed to change the economic imbalances which racial minority rule imprinted on South Africa. Now, one of the arguments you get in response to this, and I deal with it in the chapter, is that, well, in principle, that may be the case, but as long as we have the current Constitution, the judges are free to interpret this in any way they like, and the judges may interpret this in a way which prevents social and economic change. The problem with this, and that's now we're coming to the nub of my argument with Minister Sisulu, is that this has never ever been tested. Former Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke, who has had a great deal to write, has written quite a bit and said quite a bit on this issue, has pointed out on several occasions that at no stage during the entire period when he was Deputy President of the Constitutional Court did any case come before the court in which the court was asked to uphold a government action changing land redistribution in South Africa. It's never happened. And therefore, there are some voices saying quite accurately, as Judge Moseneke himself said in one of his discussions of this issue, that the politicians are blaming the Constitution for their own limitations, their own failure. You clearly can't say that you're being prevented from redistributing land by a Constitution when you've never actually tried to redistribute land in a way which would be tested by the Constitution. You can't say that the Constitution is preventing you making these changes when you've never tried to make them. And that is the nub of the issue as far as I'm concerned. Which is that there is simply no evidence to support the view that the Constitution is a block to change. And the the politicians, and we ought to bear in mind that Minister Sisulu is not the first politician to make these points. The politicians continually blame the Constitution for their own failings. And let me say that these are not just, the politicians who do this are not just politicians in the governing party. It seems to be a problem across the spectrum. The federal chairperson of the Democratic Alliance has written some entirely evidenceless and factless attacks on the court from the other perspective, which imply that every ill in the country is the fault of the court for other reasons. But the point is that until you have, if we were in the kind of situation that the United States was in the 1930s, when the Roosevelt administration was trying to push through the New Deal and the courts blocked them at every turn, then these arguments would be very strong. But we're not in that position. Political decisions have been taken and political decisions have been made not to challenge these issues, which some of us would argue is a mistake. And we're not arguing, incidentally, for some of the things you hear in the rhetoric, we're not arguing that you should pass a whole lot of laws depriving people of property and cause a great deal of violence and economic ruin as a result. We're saying that you need, as a democratic government, a coherent strategy for how you deal with the question that we're a highly unequal society. And how do you tackle the power of the people who have too much so that other people can have enough? That hasn't been done. And until it has been done, the argument that the courts are the problem is not valid. I suspect, certainly as things develop at the moment, I suspect that if that was tried, the courts would not be a problem, or certainly not under current conditions. Certainly, despite the mildly critical remarks I made earlier, the courts have not been a problem up to now. In fact, the courts have, on occasions, been ahead of the politicians. The courts have been, the Grootboom case is a good example. The Grootboom case challenges government policy at the time, which didn't provide for housing for homeless people. The famous TAT case, in which the court ruled that antiretroviral medication should be made available free of charge to expectant mothers, was also perhaps even a greater repudiation of government policy at the time. And so we go on. So if you were to look at the scorecard of 27 years of democratic constitutionalism in South Africa on the question of social and economic rights, and award points for who is actually tackling the issue, the judiciary at the moment, despite the limitations of relying on the Constitution to address these issues, the judiciary is substantially ahead of the politicians. The only point I would make in wrapping up, having defended as I have, which most of my fellow panelists will continue to do, the importance of democratic constitutionalism. I think that we need, and perhaps this is something which people in
Right, Stephen.
It's not, yeah. Sorry, if you're asking me to wrap up, I'm on my last point, so it's going to be one more minute.
Stephen,
sorry?
You're frozen for a while.
Oh, sorry. I don't know what's, yeah, it said my internet connection's unstable, but no, the last point I simply wanted to make is having made the point repeatedly that the politicians are blaming the Constitution for their own failures. I do want to inject a note of caution into this, which I think speaks to some issues Aubrey was raising. And that is that we need to continually ask questions about why there are these attacks on the Constitution. And to a certain extent, I think in some cases they are cynical, and in some cases they have to do with protecting the powerful, and certainly, to be quite specific, if you or a former president who appointed the chair of a particular commission to claim that the entire judicial system is biased against you because the person you appointed doesn't behave in the way in which you would behave, is entirely invalid. But I think that democratic constitutionalism is a very fragile plant. And I believe that it only survives when there is strong social support for it. And my concern is, as long as these inequalities persist in the gross form that they exist at the moment, as long as the patterns of the past continue to imprison us, the more likely it is that it will be difficult to find support for democratic constitutionalism when it's under threat. So although I think it's valid to question the motives of many of the people who challenged the Constitution, I think it's also important to be mindful that unless we take poverty and inequality seriously and regard the need to address them as urgent, then we may find that the needed social consensus in support of the Constitution may evaporate as people become frustrated with pressures of trying to eke out a living in the society. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. I think your last statement speaks to the problem, the elephant in the room, which is the political economy of South Africa.
Yes.
The political economy of post-apartheid, the political economy of post-white settler colonialism, that which you talk about. I mean, therefore, to say that the Constitution does not prevent the politicians from doing what they should do, raise clearly the big class question, which is why they're not doing anything to change things. That's subject for another discussion.
True.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me bring my fellow countryman and colleague, comrade, Welshman. Welshman. Welshman.
Thank you very much. I think I've now unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
I can hear and see and hear you and see you too.
Thank you very much to be part of this fascinating discussion. I must say that I enjoyed this presentation, and I've equally enjoyed the interventions by my fellow panelists in this particular discussion. Unlike my fellow panelists, I didn't prepare a statement. I came speak to the issues
you might need to switch off your picture.
I need to switch off my picture.
Your bandwidth is quite low, and that might help.
Sorry?
If you
say that again.
Off your picture, if you switch off your picture, you may get less distortion on your much more
audio.
Important things. Okay.
Very well. Let me speak video. Yes. Thank you very much. I let me just say the following. Firstly, I am singularly unqualified to speak about the South African situation. But nonetheless, I will hazard on the trigger to this debate to the extent the opinion piece penned by Minister Sisulu. I would also say in old age, I have tended to be a bit more skeptical, a bit unsure about things that I would ordinarily have been more certain of in my younger years. But this is what I understand to be the essence of the issues as raised by Minister Sisulu. I think what she's saying is worth taking heed of. Firstly, she makes the point that the constitution of any country, South Africa, is not a it is man-made. It is socially engineered to regulate basically the relationship between the state and citizens, the exercise of power, how to constrain and limit power, to facilitate sometimes this exercise. And I think that's correct. She warns against raising any constitution to the degree of scripture, however good that constitution is. Two, she makes the point which has been made in this discussion, and for me that point raises the issue: what is the constitution? What are the purposes of constitution? Sometimes we tend to repose on constitution responsibility and which are not intended for a constitution. When you begin to talk about insiders and outsiders, haves and have-nots, we must then ask ourselves, is it one of the primary functions of a constitution to deal with, for instance, social inequality? Is it one of the primary functions of a constitution to deal with a structural, deep-seated economic society? And we need to answer that question. If the answer to that question is that one of the intentions, the purpose of a constitution is to deal with such issues, then it is legitimate to raise that question in the context of South Africa. I think it's generally accepted that South Africa is one of the more equal societies in the world. And the stability of federal order, the stability of any constitutional order depends on the acceptance of the norms, the values that the Constitution enunciates. And we are reminded of some of these challenges by what I call ambition. What happened in the United States shows some of the challenges that constitutions the world over face. When a significant segment of society believes that a constitutional order is not for them or is no longer for them, you have ambition. And them Trumpism exists in South Africa. And South Africa should be able to look itself in the eye, look itself in the eye, at the promises that we made each other in 1994 with all South Africans. And those are the sort of remarks that as preliminary remarks I wish to make. I don't claim to have any answers. I do not claim to know which side is wrong, is correct, but as a comparative legal historian, I think it's the rights in South Africa to enter honestly and of each other rather than engaging in dialogue of the deaf. But let me come to I'll try and be Zimbabwean comparative scenario. I think Professor Albi, in his presentation, did a splendid job in bringing in, from a comparative perspective, the historical situation in Zimbabwe. He pointed out quite correctly that the independence constitution of Zimbabwe was loathed by almost everyone. It was loathed by the nationalist parties because it postponed what they told us fighting for, the resolution of the land question, equal majoritarian rule, and therefore it was a discredited document from day one. It, of course, was loathed by those who had fought on the side of colonialism to the extent that it brought a black majority rule. So it was always bound not to succeed from the one. And the question was always, if we all didn't like this constitution, how were we going to come up with a document that we would all like, that would all be able to relate to? Unfortunately, the ruling party, after the expression of the entrenched clauses that Albi referred to, asserted a unilateral right, arrogate to itself the power, the right, then make and unmake the constitution as deemed fit. Much of the late 80s and 90s devoted by civil society to asserting the right of the people to make a constitution for themselves. The final opportunity came during the days of the inclusive government, 2009 to 2013, the COPAC process. We then engaged in a process which we thought was inclusive and which we thought would result in a constitution that would be identified as a Zimbabwean constitution by everybody. That constitution, we took the referendum, it was adopted overwhelmingly at the referendum. But regrettably, except among the elites, except among what I could borrow the term insiders, that constitution failed to be identified as a document that we should all fight for. And hence, the amendments that are now being made to that constitution, almost the same that the ruling party is making amendments the constitution. So we've seen 2 or 3 amendments since then. And all of those amendments reasserting the old imperial precedents that we had created between approximately 1990 and the time of COPAC. And we therefore do not have the constitution as a unified principle that is the ordinary citizen less, and that immediately undermines the value of the constitution. This then, of course, compounded by the fact that a few years after the adoption of that constitution,
Welshman, you're mute.
Apologies, I lost connection, but I'm back.
Okay.
Just be brief in 2 minutes and finish my point, which is basically to Africa, where you support committed democratic value, committed in particular, we saw
Your audio is so bad now, Welshman. I think we have to, Welshman, I think we have to call it a day for you here. Connectivity is very bad for Welshman.
Let me say one sentence is getting poorer and poorer.
Yes.
So I want to simply say that we now have a situation where there is a fidelity to constitutionalism, not independence of the judiciary, the capture of practically all democratic constitutional institutions by those who executed the military coup in Robert Mugabe's government. So the differences between South Africa and Zimbabwe could not be more stark. The economies could not be more, and we are on a trajectory which is completely the opposite, at least let me say among the elites. And so those are my remarks. So in conclusion, the challenge that we have, how do we make a constitution work for both insiders and outsiders, or if I may say, how do we make everybody, or as many people as possible, insiders in the promises of our constitutional order in South Africa, be it in South Africa. Because if we don't, there will always be the populists, the Trumps of this world, who will come in, and who they do, the constitutional order becomes in jeopardy. Ipo, I thank you very much. Those are my few remarks, limited by the poor network that I have.
No, thanks, Welshman. You were able to make the point, and resoundingly so at the end. You've made the main point, the stark contrast between the South African situation, whatever its limitations, and the Zimbabwean situation, in which constitutionalism and rule of law are largely alien, and the judiciary is largely captured. I think you have made the point very well. I'm sorry that you had poor connectivity. We hope next time we'll help in getting you in a good connectivity. You must be somewhere in the bush. Thanks, Welshman. So now we have enough time for those who want to raise questions. And I'm going to ask Tony Rila, my co-host, to raise some of the questions which have come on the chat and direct them at each of our panelists. But in doing so, the panelists will respond to those observations as they wind up. So in the meantime, Tony, and then any other person, please raise your hand. There's enough room, enough time to extend the discussion. Thank you. Tony?
Thank you, Ivo, and thank you. This, I think, has been such a rich discussion for those of us sitting north of the Limpopo and further up. And thanks to everybody. There hasn't been a lot in the chat, but maybe I can just pick up a couple of themes. that were picked and linked to them. The first really is to Albie, and the point about the homegrown process. And I was very struck by the notion that what was critical in that homegrown process was the creation of regional and international solidarity for a domestic process for a country in a crisis. And I think that's very important to look at in the context of Zimbabwe. And that links back to Welsh's last point, and sorry if the connectivity was so bad, but as he pointed out, the contrast between Zimbabwe and South Africa could not be greater. And as Zimbabwe sits in a particular crisis now, in which it seems that everything is loading down on Zimbabwe to sort out their own domestic problems, the real question is that if we are to solve the problem around adherence to constitutionalism, not necessarily the establishment of a new constitution, but the way in which an existing constitution might be implemented properly, what is the role of that kind of solidarity? So I think that's a very important one. The second one, I think, really came out of Stephen's presentation. And I think Stephen's presentation is very important for the role in which political economy factors have a major effect on the way in which constitutionalism, rule of law, and human rights actually are respected, and how to work out the balance between the important role of the courts and, in at least in the Zimbabwe context, the ways in which the state absolutely disregards every single one aspect of those things. The third thing I think really came out of Rwanda, which was, I think, very important, where she amplified the ways in which the rule of law is critical, and the link between constitutionalism and rule of law. And I'm throwing these open to everyone else. And then, of course, Aubrey raised some really important questions. And this has been really at the heart of the constitutional project in Zimbabwe, and the notion that started in the late 1990s with the notion of a people-generated constitution, and the ways in which, to some extent, that is captured by elites. How do we capture the nature of the processes under which people have lived, and the processes under which they wish to live in the future, and to be authentic to their own aspirations? And I think implicitly he's asking the question about whether constitutionalism or the creation of constitutions are, to some extent, a very elite project. So I'm throwing those observations out, and hopefully we'll get some feedback from everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, before we bring the panelists, Eleanor, have your hand up. Eleanor Sisulu.
Yes, the lights are dark here, so I'm not putting my camera. ESCOM is not working. We need a constitutional intervention to get them to work. But I want to say, first of all, Aubrey's point about insiders and outsiders and language, I think is an extremely important point. And language is an issue. The United Nations has declared 1922 to 1932 the decade of indigenous languages. And this has been prompted by a worldwide observation that indigenous languages are being increasingly marginalized. They've been threatened with extinction, and that speakers of those languages are disadvantaged. And I think the one area where they are most disadvantaged is when it comes to constitution, because constitutionalism is mostly in English, or in the case of other countries, it's the language, or the colonial language in which it's articulated. And I think it's important that, and I wish that the Constitution, the South African Constitution, protects the linguistic rights of everybody. And actually there's constitutional constitutionally, people should be able to get educated in the language of their choice. But in practice, this doesn't happen. So I think this is a classic case where the Constitution actually, opposite of preventing inclusion, is actually is constitutionally protected. People's linguistic rights are constitutionally protected. But whether that becomes a substantive right, it's a case of political will, and maybe a case of the kind of coloniality that Aubrey referred to. So, I would wish for a popular, I think constitutions would be incredibly enriched if there was a huge investment into those discourses in all the languages. And I think rights of people would be better protected. We have a case in South Africa where the quality of court interpretation, because of low investment and not spending on interpreters and proper training, has compromised the quality of legal representation that marginalized people get in the courts. So there's a real practical issue there. But I think I want to comment from a human rights point of view that, South Africa is not different from the rest of Africa. It's part and parcel of the continent. And I think to me, there's a difference of degree in constitutionality, but there's also a continuum. And I think the word accountability didn't come in anyway. That constitutions, no matter how defective they are an instrument to keep the ruling class accountable. And I think the African experience has told us that it's really important. Things like limitation of terms of the president, for which Africans across the continent has fought long and hard for, are based on 33 decades of post-independence rule in Africa. And I think really South Africans would be really wise to pay attention to those processes in the rest of the continent, and that there's a value to your constitutionality. I won't say the Constitution, I will say constitutionality, because even under the most defective constitution, if you have a level of constitutionality, the courts can be a terrain of struggle for the poor, for the marginalized, for the oppressed. And even under apartheid, we saw that the courts was a very important terrain of struggle. So I get terrified when politicians start attacking constitutions, because I don't trust their motives. I think I would react differently when it comes from other sectors of the society. But I think when it comes to politicians, and the narrative is the same. We can say South Africa is different, but the narrative, the sound, and I think the impulses that are driving those attacks are not much just Finally, I just want to pay tribute to the incredible judges that South Africa has, to Arthur Chaskelson, Pius Langa, Albie himself, Edwin Cameron. I think these are amazing human beings. And I must say, I felt deeply insulted when they were called quislings. I think the jump from criticizing the Constitution, which is a valid thing to do, and actually insulting judges is for me, I didn't see the link between the two. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor. Anybody else before I ask the panelists to come in and wind up? Anybody else? Aubrey, I saw your hand, but I will call on you just now as we wind up. Let's begin then. I'll begin. Welshman, are you able to say anything? As winding up? Welshman? Or where is your system broken down altogether? Welshman? Okay, we'll forgive you, Welshman. We forgive you. Stephen? It's okay, Welshman. We'll forgive you. Stephen?
Yeah, I think just to say, I was asked a question on the chat, which I tried to respond to, but let me just give you a couple of minutes. And it's a point that is commonly made, which is that, yes, the letter of the law of the Constitution doesn't prevent change, but the judges prevent change because they have a particular view. You know, in this discussion that I was talking about, which this is based, I mean, I go into that at great length. But suffice it to say that there just isn't any evidence to support this. This claim that the judges have ruled in a way which prevents change. So, you know, I'm obviously not going to sum up a discussion of engagement with half a dozen legal scholars. But I think if you look at the court records and if you look at what arguments are being made, you will see that the argument that judges have been ruling in a way which prevents change because they have a particular perspective isn't actually borne out by the evidence of their judgments. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. Aubrey?
Thank you, Ivo. I was not raising my hand, actually. This is how I gesticulate to look intelligent. Let me start with a declaration. I am not a rabid opponent of the Constitution. In fact, for the next 12 months, I'm the chairperson of the Constitutionalism Fund in South Africa, a fund that was put together by donor organizations to promote constitutionalism in South Africa. That said, I inhabit many worlds. Two of the worlds I inhabit is the world as it is and the world as it should be. And therefore my critique and sometimes criticism of our constitutional order represents it in an attempt to travel from the world as it is to the world as it should be. I think another point I must make, again, to steal from Stephen, the point of insiders and outsiders. If you check, you will realize that all of us, without exception, simultaneously occupy the position of insider and outsider. And we do so in multiple ways. And if this binary of insider and outsider is regarded as an identity, we then have multiple identities. For instance, take the question of language. I have argued that the majority of South Africans are outsiders. But we are outsiders too because we have no access or have very little access to the stories they tell about the South African story. And in terms of class, the same thing happens. You can pick any indicator. Simultaneously, we all occupy this position of insider and outsider. So as much as I can speak with righteous indignation about language, I myself am an insider to the extent that I belong to a group of people outside those who are not eloquent in the grammar of English, not just as a language, but as cultural expression. But another thing is this. We or it has become commonsensical that the only democratic option available is the liberal democratic option. I always argue, as one who taught English, that the word liberal is an adjective describing the noun democracy, which means potentially there are other adjectives we can put in front of the noun democracy, which means therefore there are other democratic options that are available to us. Democratic options that are known and democratic options that are unknown to the extent that they still need to be created. And therefore, when I talk about all constitutions being representing the triumph of a particular worldview, I am also talking about the extent to which we tend to pretend there's only one democratic option available to us. Let me say the last thing is this, Ivo, maybe the last two things. We extol the independence of the judiciary. Now, if I'm correct in saying that our constitutional order and the Constitution itself, and therefore our judiciary, represent the triumph of a particular worldview which has become dominant. In relation to that worldview, they are not independent. The last point I must make is that, you know, I keep on talking about the never-ending task of renewal. Let me borrow from physics. If you speed up an object fast enough, at a certain speed, that object will disappear. When it comes to discourse, philosophical and otherwise, if you slow down a particular reality, such as slowing down the speed with which you travel from the world as it is to the world as it should be, a few centuries down the line, you have people who have no memory, individual or collective, of where the point of departure was. And therefore, in the same way, with all the zigzagging, but ultimately leading to a point of change, it's quite possible that what you have with this never-ending task of renewing our constitutional order and the Constitution, you may end up with an order that is the antithesis of what was there at the point of departure. But this task of renewal is not possible unless you do what J. Krishnamurti says, that we need to free ourselves from the known. And if we free ourselves from the known, we engage in the task each time when we find a new known of reaching for freedom from that known. For me, that's the ever-ending task must engage in.
Thanks, Aubrey. Thanks very much indeed. Luando? Luando, your last words? Is Luando still there? Luando?
She's gone, Ebo. Move to Albie.
Albie, your last words, Albie? As you began, so you end for us. Albie? It's also gone, eh?
His mic is
muted.
He's muted. He's muted. He needs to unmute.
Albie, unmute. Albie. Albie.
Yes, I was wondering why you weren't laughing at my jokes. I said I'm used to being the last as the only judge on the panel, except you are the judge of the judge. and I was just thinking, you know, how rich the discussion was, because it was so diverse. Every voice was different. Every point of departure was different. And you know, from Luando, I picked up the importance of one case. You tell such a story through one case. It does so much to refute false things that are said about the court and the constitution and so on, just through one case. From Aubrey, the importance of being. It just took me back so much in a strange way. I don't have your ancestors, Aubrey. My ancestors are kind of very, very different. But joining the struggle and marching down the street, singing the songs, and I'm singing songs, I don't even know what the words mean. And somebody laughs, Fiximabizera, she said, Albie, you know what you're singing? I said, no. She said, you're singing, when we get hold of the right whites, we'll show them what. But I'm singing away because I'm Africanizing myself, if you like, by shedding my tight white skin, but I don't speak African languages, I'm not fully involved. And that diversity of South Africa is part of our richness, and it also can become a curse, and the importance of dealing with that. Stephen, you provoke always strong responses in me, because you write strongly and not according to any fixed paradigm. And usually I agree with 2/3 and I disagree with 1/3. I think I agree with everything you said today, but that might could be because my law clerk married your son, who was also a law clerk at the court. But I think we have a kind of feeling for constitutionalism that's based not simply on the idea, but having seen it in practice, seeing it functioning, seeing what it means in society. Welshman, I so wished I could have heard more because there was so much interference in what you were saying. Because to such a large extent, the agony of Zimbabwe, the moments of hope and the moments of depression has been extremely influential in South Africa. It's part of our never again. Our never again is not only never again apartheid, and never again the horrible exclusion of the humanity of the majority of our people, never again the conquest and the past laws and the Bantustans and the disrespect and so on. But it's also the never again of people who fought in the freedom struggle, often very, very bravely, going on to become oppressors and seeing that our constitution, we must have land reform. We don't want land grabbing to give it out to the sons-in-law and you know of the people who are in power. You know, there's other kinds of never again. The term limits the importance of that. Having independent institutions, Chapter 9, the Independent Electoral Commission, strong protections for that. The Judicial Service Commission, strong protections for that. The Auditor General playing such an important role. So I'm sad to say that some of the painful experiences of Zimbabwe entered into our constitution making in a very, very profound way. You had great moments when at one stage you did draft the new constitution with terrific involvement and participation. And it was sad to see that promise that seemed to hold at that time wasn't fully fulfilled. I'm going to end up with another kind of dichotomy, and that's between skepticism and cynicism. And I think it's extremely important for those of us who think of ourselves as intellectuals and people configuring in the public debate. And skepticism, demanding evidence, challenging positions, holding people accountable is absolutely fundamental to what we do and to constitutionalism. Constitutions in that sense are based on skepticism, that nobody is anointed by history to take over and to rule well. And we guard not only against return to the past, and new oppressors, we guard against ourselves. And we were certainly aware of that. But cynicism is something toxic. Cynicism is a world of manipulation, of using words and phrases and ideas, twisting them around, ignoring things when you don't want them. And we find it inside South Africa. It's being fought out to some extent in the courts in relation to a particular case involving a judicial officer. I won't go beyond that. But the cynical view is of humanity, it's of institutions, it's of all politicians, it's of all freedom fighters, it's of the trade union movement, it's of the women's movement, it's of the dreams that we each have as individuals. There's a negativity that's corrosive and undermining. Skepticism is challenging everything. And the debate that was launched by the minister initially, to my mind, was based on deep, profound cynicism. It's not only the subject matter, but the tone, the moment of its presentation by somebody who'd been at the Constitutional Assembly, who had cheered and fought hard for rights in the Constitutional Assembly, who'd been a believer then. It made it, to me, a cynical introduction to the debate. But I don't want to go beyond that. I am cautious as a former judge of becoming engaged in current controversies and events, particularly if they might end up in court. But somehow, because this was about the courts, it's about my colleagues, it's about people like Pius Lange and Defam Moseneki and Sisi Kampepe and wonderful, wonderful human beings, compassionate, thoughtful, revolutionary in their spirit and their thinking and the ways that they do. To my mind, that can only be attributed to a sort of cynicism and not to the skepticism that we need. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Albie. I think you have summarized it very well and concluded the debate for time being, the distinction between skepticism and cynicism. But more than that, I think you have really summarized, and it takes us back to the quotation from Stephen, which I read at the beginning, and highlights the point that Aubrey has made. Every epoch has its challenges. Ours are just so enormous at the moment. And the elephant in the room is the political economy of our countries, which go beyond constitutions. But yet, and very important in this very turbulent times, constitutionalism and rule of law are the best defense that we can have in the moment. I think Luando's passionate presentation said it all. But therefore, I want to thank the panelists, Albie, Luando, Aubrey, Stephen, and Welshman. Thank you very much indeed. And as I said earlier on, this program has been recorded, be transcribed, be published as a policy document so that students of politics and constitutionalism can read in the various institutions, and that such rich discussion is captured for posterity. Thank you very much. And I want to thank my niece, Eleanor Sisulu, for helping put this together. He's done a fantastic job and getting people like Albie on this platform. Thanks very much indeed, and good night.
Africa, moni oyo ya boye kaina pana mawa na kokate basusu oyo na bonaka